Good morning, you guys. It's your boy Ben Mahari here, representing Mahari Nation Sports Podcast. Much love to the entire LDBC and the entire basketball community. Tonight, we're gonna have basketball conversations at 9 p.m. Central Time. We're gonna discuss, some about the preseason, about James Harden and his weight situation, and an investigation going on with the LA Clippers too. So you guys have been hearing about what's been going on with the Clippers as well. So we're gonna get into all that good stuff later on tonight at 9 p.m. Central Time. So stay tuned. Don't miss out on a great show of basketball conversations. So with that being said, let's get down to business here, shall we? So this is again another episode of Morning Historical Perspective. Another poll that I did posted on there yesterday about which final series you guys wanted me to cover on. So today we're going to be covering about the 1998 NBA Finals, and to this day, this is personally my all-time favorite NBA Finals series in the history of NBA basketball by far. Um, it's pretty much still a series that people still talk about to this very day, and it was one of the big synopses of the Last Dance documentary. If you guys watched it during the early stages of the pandemic, um, pretty much this was the Bulls' sixth finals appearance of the '90s in 8 years. For the Utah Jazz, they're pretty much their finals rivals. This was their second straight trip to the NBA Finals. Um, Pretty much there was an era finality of this whole final series. And if, in all sincerity, when you look back at that series, it felt like it was an era. It was pretty much the beginning of the end of a great era of the '90s. No disrespect to the San Antonio Spurs, but it was pretty much the end of that particular era of basketball. During that period, that great era of this, hard nosed competitive basketball up until like the mid 2000s. But in that series, it was pretty much two teams that pretty much have gotten to pretty much know each other at this particular point. They were both had the same identical records, except that Utah beat Chicago both times in the during the regular season. And but as you guys know, the regular season don't mean jack. And this was pretty much a lot of storylines to these between these two teams. Because Chicago at the start of the 97-98 season, Jerry Krause, the general manager, and Jerry Reinsdorf were ready to break up this team and basically start all over again. And they pretty much gave out 1 year contracts to both Pippen and to I'm sorry, not to Pippen, but Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson. You know what I'm saying? And then also, Pippen's long contract of 7 years and 18 millions was finally on his last year, and he was going to be pretty much an unrestricted free agent, and was going to be looking for a long term deal, which you knew that the Bulls weren't going to give to him anyway. So, and the other fact of the matter is that 10 other players from that Bulls team were going to be free agents at the end of the year, and pretty much before the start of training camp, Bill Jackson famously wrote down the team's program for the entire season, and it illustrated on the quotes "Last Dance." And as Bill Wennington said during the documentary, he said he pretty much Jackson told the team, "Enjoy this one, guys, because this is it. This is it. At the end of the season, this is it. It's all over." And so it was pretty much an era of a finality within this Bulls team. A team that it pretty much was the dynasty of the '90s. You know what I'm saying? For the Utah Jazz, they've been a team that has been together since the mid '80s. With Stockton and Malone, pretty much seeking their first ever NBA championship. And if you guys who pretty much know your basketball, they went through the gauntlet of the West during the early '80s with the Showtime Lakers, and then went through first round exits, burnouts in the Western Conference Finals, and then ultimately making it through in '97 thanks to John Stockton's game winner against the Houston Rockets. Um, Almost a decade in the making that they reached the NBA Finals. Then in that famous '97 series, they took the Bulls to 7 games. Out of those two I should say 4 out of the 6 games of that series, it came down to the final possession. Um, the Bulls simply made the bigger plays while the Utah Jazz didn't. Now, with Karl Malone and the way he played in that series, he didn't do particularly bad. Um, when you look back at that final series back in 1997 between those two teams, okay, Karl Malone in that series, he actually averaged 23.8 points per game and averaged 10 rebounds a game while shooting 44% from the field, which is not bad. But for a guy that won MVP that year, you expect a lot more, considering the fact that Michael Jordan scored 32 points per game and shot 45% from the field. You know what I'm saying? Um, and also had one of the greatest performances in NBA history when he played with a stomach virus and dropped 38 points in a critical game when the series was tied at 2 games apiece. Thankfully, in the '98 finals, nobody was going to be sick, so thank goodness for that. But during that '98 finals, the Bulls, swept the Nets in 3 games, but it wasn't easy. The first game went into overtime. Um, then they went through the Charlotte Hornets after the Hornets came back and won game 2 to tie up the series, courtesy of B.J. Armstrong's clutch shooting. All right, they came back, won the next 3 games. Then they went through a tough and gritty 7 game series against their divisional rival Indiana Pacers. Probably the one team that gave the Bulls the most fits because remember, Indiana was deep that year. They went at least 8 to 9 players deep. Because not just with their starting lineup, but they had 4 other players off their bench, like Travis Best, Jalen Rose, Derek McKee, and also Antonio Davis off their bench. This was a really deep team that really took the Bulls to the limit. And in that game 7, they were actually up by as many as by as many as 3 points with about 5 minutes to go in the game before Steve Kerr hit the clutch streak to tie the ball game, and then pretty much after that, the Bulls made all the hustle plays down the stretch that pretty much determined the outcome of the game, and the Bulls barely escaped Game 7 with a 5 point victory and advanced to the finals. While for the Utah Jazz, um, the first round they survived a scare against their arch rival Houston Rockets in a tough 5 game series. Then they went up against the San Antonio Spurs, the up and coming Spurs led by an up and coming Tim Duncan. All right, and they barely escaped by with in a tough 5 game series. Then went up against the up and coming LA Lakers with Shaq and Kobe. Saying that loaded team, and they swept through that team with ease in 4 straight. So, in all honesty, you would think that looking back, you would think that the Jazz would have all the advantages, considering that they had 10 days rest. They were pretty much rested, ready to go, while the Bulls had to scrape through a tough 7 game series. So looking back at that series, many felt that the Jazz had the best opportunity to basically dethrone, the Chicago Bulls in terms of winning their first NBA championship. But you know, you gotta you gotta find a way to beat Michael Jordan 4 times. I mean, that's the only way. That's the only good saying is you gotta beat greatness 4 straight times to become a champion. And it was going to be a big time battle to the finish. So pretty much at the start of game 1, you know, pretty much at the start of game 1, the Bulls, showed some fatigue and some of the after effects of that first round. I'm sorry, after that conference finals against the Pacers, while the Jazz were slowly trying to get their legs back after a long layoff. And game 1 went into overtime until John Stockton scored the last 5 points to pretty much get the Jazz a 3 point victory. But then in game 2, Michael Jordan and his Bulls, made some serious adjustments by forcing the pick and roll from the side to the sideline, and then trapping the pick and roll with another big guard and Harper, and forcing the Jazz out of their set offenses. This was going to be key in the first 2 game. This was going to be key in game 3, and what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But when you look back at for the first 2 games of that series, um, Karl Malone actually was shooting horribly. All right, in the first game, in game one, um, in pretty much in game one, Karl Malone shot actually 9 at 25 and only scored 21 points while grabbing 14 rebounds, which is bad shooting night, but they were able to get away with it. But then in game two, it got worse. In game two, Karl Malone actually shot 5 of 16 and only scored 16 points. So already in the first two games, he was already shooting at least between 31 to 30% from the field. Like, from a guy that is supposed to dominate on the inside, he was basically settling for perimeter jump shots. The same shots that he would hit. But he, the thing that I remember when watching those two games, I asked myself, why wasn't he not attacking the basket as much as he should and getting the front line in foul trouble? Because remember, the weakness of the Bulls had at that time was they were weak on the front line. You know, when you get through Rodman, when you get through Longley, they had no one else to basically contend with on the front line. Bill Wennington couldn't guard Carmelo to save his life. Dickie Simpkins couldn't guard him. So why did he didn't attack the basket as much as he should? It's one of the things that I looked at when I was watching the tapes. But the Bulls were able to do what they had to do and get the split that they needed. Then the series shifted to Chicago, and this is when everything went crazy. Now, looking back at that Last Dance documentary, the Bulls were due for a breakout performance, but but no one could have predicted what was going to take place. And in fact, the Utah Jazz were actually off to a good start there too when Karl Malone was hitting his first six shots. Right, you would think that the Jazz will be able to figure this out and retake the home court advantage. But boy, did things went bad. Because then after that, the Bulls just jumped on them in the second and third quarters of those of in game three. So pretty much what the Bulls were doing was they basically trapped Stockton from half court, making him give up the ball when he had to, right? And John Stockton in that game, he basically had 5 turnovers, pretty much all in the between the second and third quarters. Because what they did was they trapped the pick and roll, making him go baseline and making him move his feet and making him throw bad passes off of those double teams from the sideline, right? Then when John Stockton was ready to bring the ball up the court, guess what happened? Ron Harper and Scottie Pippen would be waiting for him in half court, and they would force John Stockton to throw the ball, against the double team, and sometimes the passes were offline, right? And pretty much they did it. The Bulls defense did a great job of trapping the pick and roll, taking away their ability to pretty much work their offense, right? So, with that being said, the Bulls just blitzed on them and pretty much blew them out 96 to 54 in one of the biggest routes in NBA Finals history, going back to the 84 series, right? Then in Game 4, the Jazz did make some adjustments, but then Dennis Rodman's defense against Karl Malone was critical, as he basically did a great job of defending him. Malone did score 21 points, but again, it was another bad shooting night, shooting in 10 to 20, 21. And John Stockton shot 3 of 11 and then basically did a better job of not turning the ball over as much, but you know, they the Bulls were able to just make the bigger plays, in the end that pretty much decided the outcome. With Dennis Rodman, doing his job on the boards, he had 14 rebounds in that game, and then Michael Jordan with a couple of post-up scores pretty much sealed the game for the Bulls to go up 3 games to 1, and pretty much counting down the celebration. And looking back at that game 5, um, the fans in Chicago were ready to celebrate, the end of an era. And pretty much all over the country, they were anticipating the Bulls to pretty much wrap up the series and celebrate perhaps their final championship of the decade, solidifying them as a team of the 90s, right? But the Utah Jazz had another thing coming. And The big adjustment that the Jazz did on their offense was instead of using exclusively the pick and roll, they went more to a straight up post up isolation with Karl Malone. What I mean is they pretty much stopped playing pick and roll. They pretty much let Karl Malone work one on one against either Luke Longley or Dennis Rodman with no pick and roll. But what they did was they inserted Antoine Carr as the center in place of Greg Osutag, Greg Foster, or was it Adam Keefe? Right, yeah, Adam Keefe. Because Antoine Carr had the ability to shoot from mid range. So what that did was that it opened up the floor even more to allow Karl Malone to work inside of the paint. And that night, Karl Malone finally woke up out of his chamber and had one of his greatest performances of his career when he shot 17 for 27 from the field and then scored 39 points in that deciding game five. Michael Jordan, basically scored 28 points, but he only shot 9 of 26. Scottie Pippen struggled all night. He shot 2 for 16. Um, only Kukoc was the only man that showed up for the Bulls that night. How ironic when he scored 30 points and shot 11 of 13 from the field. But the building was anticipating a celebration, but the Utah Jazz pretty much put a halt to that and pretty much said, we're going back to Salt Lake City, and you're gonna have to beat us there because we're going to Game 7. And pretty much the Jazz did what they were supposed to. They got at least one game in Chicago to bring the series back to Utah, and they did that. And commend the Utah Jazz for playing just a gritty game, and they were the ones who made the bigger plays down the stretch. And Malone was hitting shots from mid range. He was driving the ball to the basket, and pretty much was playing what he was supposed to should have been playing in the earlier part of the series. But better late than never. So, but then we get into Game 6, and this is perhaps the greatest finals game of all time. Pretty much, it was a back and forth game down to the final possession, right? But let's keep this in mind about a couple of things here. Um, Scottie Pippen was pretty much wrecked from the amount of charges that he took, in the games in Chicago, right? And early in the game, um, Scottie Pippen pretty much received the post pass and dunked the basketball and pretty much re-injured the back. It gradually got worse and worse as the game went on, and Pippen was pretty much done. There was no stability in that back, and trust me, I played with that similar back injury that he had. Trust me, it's not fun. You can't even bend down, you can't even run straight, and you can't even squat down to play defense. It's really really horrible to deal with. You know what I'm saying? So he only scored 8 points in the whole game. So pretty much to keep pace, the Bulls went to Michael Jordan exclusively the entire game. And remember, Michael Jordan at this stage of his career, right, as great of a player that he was, in 98, he was 34 years old, right? Literally carrying his team at this point, right? The big question was going to be, even at the age of 34, no matter, despite the fact of how great he was, you would think he's got to run out of gas at some point because you can only do so much. But Michael, as he always has, rose to the occasion when the team needed him the most. But there were some stretches where he was shooting the ball, particularly bad. But when he had his opportunities, exclusively against Byron Russell, he pretty much torched the hell out of him, right? Through post ups, mid range shots, 3 point shots. The guy was pretty much a scoring machine. He in the first half he scored 23 points and pretty much kept the Bulls into the game. And then as the game went on, exclusively, there was one critical possession in during the game, which Howard Isley was had to force up a three with the shot clock running down, and he drilled it right. Unfortunately, corrupt official Dick Pavetta, and I call him a corrupt company official for a reason, right? He pretty much ruled that Howard Isley, the backup point guard for the Jazz, his 3 point shot did not count it. Although the NBC sports replays showed that the shot was on time before the clock read zero. But remember, there was no instant replay at the time. during the 90s. So the referees weren't allowed to rewind it back and check out the replay to see if the shot did count it. Now, if that were to be the case today, I promise you, they would have looked at the replay and pretty much determined that the shot should have counted. But it was 98, no replay, so no 3-point shot. All right. So pretty much it was a back and forth game, down the stretch. You know what I'm saying? And there was another possession in the fourth quarter, and I think it had something to do with Ron Harper too. He he had the ball and basically ran through the right side of the court and hit a runner, and the ball was still partially in his hand as the shot went up as the clock went zero, but that shot did count it. Now, think about this for a moment, okay? Pretty much as the fourth quarter went on, right? That was a swing play of 5 missed calls of shot clock violations. Because remember, the referees took away the Howard Isley 3-pointer, but they gave Ron Harper his 2 points on that runner in the fourth quarter. So, in a sense, that's a 5-point swing on missed calls that pretty much was the difference as the game progressed, right? So, even though the Jazz held on to a 49-45 lead at halftime and pretty much kept the 5-point lead at the end of the quarter, all right. As the game went down to the final stretch, John Stockton hit a late 3-pointer with 41 seconds to go to give the Jazz an 86-83 lead. And sitting back and watching that game, you think that the Jazz were got this in the bag and they were getting ready to force Game 7, right? But just like we've seen this many, many times, this was only the beginning of the script to the great ending of one of the greatest players of all time. So, coming out of that possession, and I remember this off the top of my head, even when I was watching this as a little boy. Michael Jordan took the inbound pass, drove the ball, and got a layup to basically quickly get the score to cut the lead to one. Right. Then on the next Utah possession, they were getting ready to give Carmelo the ball on the left side of the block against Dennis Rodman. The same familiar situation in Game 5. Spread the floor, give Karl Malone a chance to work one on one, right? Except Michael Jordan was actually on the blind side as he was getting ready to steal the ball because he remembered the same situation from Game 5. And this time around, you understand what I'm saying? Michael Jordan was ready and prepared for it. And he came out of nowhere to strip Karl Malone of the basketball. All right. And this time around, Michael Jordan had the ball in his hand with 16 seconds was basically with 16 seconds to go. And Byron Russell. Now, a little bit of a backstory on this one. As you remember in the documentary, um, Byron Russell, I should say Brian Russell, right? Was basically and his basically had talked a little bit of trash to Michael Jordan when he was in retirement at the time. This is when the Jazz were in town at the Bulls practice facility, and as you guys remember, Brian Russell went up to Michael Jordan, rookie at the time, and said, "Hey, why'd you quit? You know I could guard you. You know what? You had to quit." And you knew Michael Jordan was going to remember that, right? So fast forward to basically to the big moment, right? So the floor was spread. Everybody in the building knew what was going to happen, and then Michael Jordan through the left side drove to the middle, made a quick crossover move, and no, he didn't push off. I'm getting tired of people keep saying that Michael Jordan pushed off. He did not push off. It was the cleanest ankle breaker you'll ever see. Literally broke Brian Russell's ankles and drilled the jump shot to give the Bulls an 87-86 lead with 5.2 seconds to go. Then on the last possession, Stockton took the inbound pass, and if you look back at the replay, Antoine Carr was actually open underneath the basket, and Stockton could have thrown the pass, but unfortunately he's only what 6'1", 6'3", so he wasn't able to basically look over his shoulder to make the pass. And basically, Stockton took the inbound pass, took the three to try to win the game, and unfortunately he missed. And after the battle for the tip, the clock runs out, and the Chicago Bulls went on to win their sixth championship in 8 years and their last championship of the decade. Michael Jordan pretty much won Finals MVP with another brilliant performance. Um, in one of the greatest final series of the '90s. All right, Michael Jordan closed out his great career with Chicago, scoring 33 and a half points per game, shooting 41% from the field and 81% from the foul line. Right. Um, Statistically, he didn't shot his highest percentage of any of those final series, but when it came down to the big moments and the big plays, Michael did what he pretty much had to do. For Karl Malone, he averaged 25 points per game, shot 40%, shot 50% from the field. You know what I'm saying? And did better from the foul line from 78%. But unfortunately, he forever will take criticism for showing up small in those big moments. Although he had two good performances in games 5 and 6, but it was pretty much a little too late type of situation because if he didn't shoot horribly in those earlier games in the series, I think it could have changed the outcome of the series. But you know, that's hindsight is 2020. But that final series to this day is pretty much the highest rated final series of all time. So according to the Nielsen TV ratings, I actually looked this up. It had an 18.7 and even surpassed the Nielsen ratings of the '98 World Series, which is making it the first time in the history of the NBA that a final series had a higher rating than the World Series. And as of as of 2012, this was the only final series that was played outside of either Texas or California. And until 2014, with the Spurs and the Heat, and then obviously with the Warriors and the Cavaliers going through their whole finals matchups, this was the last consecutive finals that had a rematch. But pretty much after that series was over with, the breakup of the Bulls began. Um, Phil Jackson took a year off before ultimately accepting the coaching job in Los Angeles and basically won five more championships in the 2000s. Um, Ron Harper would stay with the Bulls for one more year before ultimately joining Phil Jackson in Los Angeles, winning two more titles in 2000 and 2001. Michael Jordan in January of '99, after the lockout had ended, announced his retirement for the second time, but ultimately would come back for a second time in 2001 with the Washington Wizards as the general manager. Um, Scottie Pippen would get his big time money contract, but ultimately it was through a sign and trade as he got traded to the Houston Rockets and played a couple more seasons until 2004. Dennis Rodman would end up being released by the team, and then he would sign with the Lakers, for only 23 games in '99 before ultimately, being released. Steve Kerr would basically would have been resigned by the Bulls, but end up being traded by the Spurs, and then end up winning two more championships with the Spurs in '99 and 2003. As for the Jazz, they would continue to make their regular postseason appearances until 2003, but unfortunately for Stockton and Malone, they wouldn't reach even beyond the conference finals again after that. Um, pretty much that series was the end of an era for both of those teams. You know what I mean? It was great theater between great players and great coaches, and also rest in peace to Jerry Sloan too as well. Um, it was pretty much great theater. It was a great series between two outstanding teams that really took it to the physical limit to give the NBA fans like myself a series that people still talk about to this day. And unfortunately, for Stockton and Malone, you know, the big knock against their legacy is that they didn't win that championship. But if we're being honest here, all the great players like Malone, Stockton, Barkley, you know, those guys, and even Reggie Miller too, all fell short, even Patrick Ewing, of winning that championship. because the dominance of how Michael Jordan was during that time in that great Bulls team. I mean, those are the things that will happen. It doesn't take away what they were as great players, but this is what happens when you ran against great teams like what the Bulls were during the '90s. And that '98 final series was the was pretty much the end of a great era of the basketball during the '90s. As all the other teams during the '90s went through their twilight years, and you know, I'll forever be grateful watching that great moment when Michael Jordan pretty much sealed his Hall of Fame career with that crossover against Brian Russell. And yeah, there was nothing much to be said other than the fact that these two teams gave everything they had to give all sports fans a great series that we're still going to talk about to this day. So that's pretty much my 2 cents. You let me know what you think in the comment sections below. And with that, I'm out. Peace.